ønske ham velkommen.
So thank you, and it's great to be here. I always feel very at home when I come to Norway. I grew up on the west coast of Canada in British Columbia, and prior to coming here, I didn't think it was possible for anyone to love Gore-Tex rain jackets more than we do. But Norway does, and I love it. I'm going to talk a bit about the impact that electric vehicles can have on oil. And I work with an organization called Bloomberg New Energy Finance, and we gather data about what's going on in the clean energy transition around the world. So I'm going to present some of that data. There's a few charts, so bear with me. I promise there's also some pictures of cars. So prices on electric cars will continue to drop until they're within reach of the average family. The problem is this was in 1915, and this is what electric vehicles looked like then, when they had a similar share of the US market. So what I'm going to talk about is why things are different this time. And the best place to start is with battery prices. So we've been gathering data on EV lithium-ion battery prices since 2010. We survey the market every year. And over that time, they dropped from around $1,000 a kilowatt hour to about $350 a kilowatt hour last year. And that's an average for plug-in hybrids and battery electrics. And that's the cell and the pack costs. So the actual cell costs are much lower, and some of the high volume buyers are already much lower than that. We're crunching through our data right now for 2016. It looks like it's going to be about $250. So coming down very steeply. And of course, electric vehicle sales have increased dramatically over the same period. About 500,000 sold last year globally. Right now, we're trending towards about 700,000 sold this year. This is just passenger vehicles. It doesn't include commercial vehicles and also doesn't include low-speed electric vehicles. So you've got falling battery prices, but there's also purchase subsidies and fuel economy regulations playing a very big role there. And then you're seeing the automakers really get behind it and launching a lot of new models into the market, and just in general, more consumer awareness of the potential. This actually shows some data that we gather on all of the number of electric vehicle models available all throughout the world. So that's BEV, battery electric vehicles, plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, and fuel cell vehicles. And what you can see is we're in the middle of this very steep ramp up. So this is based on the disclosed launch plans of all of the automakers around the world. So we're in this very steep ramp up period, a lot more consumer choice coming to the market. And when people think about electric vehicles, they often think of it in the context of sort of global pollutants and reducing CO2. But we're seeing increasing pressure much more at the local level as well. So expect to see a lot more of this in the coming years as cities look to address local air quality pollution issues as much as global ones. But electrification isn't the only thing going on in the automotive sector right now. You also have this rise of new mobility services, things like car sharing. You have about 5 million car sharing users in Europe right now. Ride-hailing services like Uber, delivering hundreds of millions of trips. And you're seeing investment really spiking into these from almost nothing a few years ago, so tens of billions of dollars in the last couple of years. The reason this is relevant is that these types of applications increase the average utilization of a vehicle. So our own personal vehicles end up getting used sort of 3 or 4% of the time. In these types of new mobility applications, they end up getting used much more, sometimes 50, 60% of the time if they're really being heavily used. And what that does is it improves the economics of electrification. So electric vehicles still have a higher upfront cost and will continue to do so for quite some time. But if you spread those costs over more kilometers, they have a lower operating cost, lower fuel costs, and lower maintenance. So these applications that dramatically increase the utilization of a vehicle can stand to accelerate and mutually reinforce this trend you're seeing on electrification. Let's come back to the battery prices. We spent a lot of time looking at the relationship between volume and price. So basically, how much decrease in price do you get for every increase in volume of lithium-ion battery demand in the world? So those are those same data points that I presented at the beginning, down from $1,000 down to about $350. Now, humans are really good at hammering out costs of things that we make over and over and over. So if you look at the reason solar PV has been so disruptive, it's because it has an experience curve or a learning rate of about 26%. Every time you double cumulative manufactured capacity of solar panels, you decrease costs about 26%. We spend a lot of time trying to figure out what the relationship is for batteries, because that is probably one of the most important questions facing the entire energy sector right now. So we've come up with sort of these forecasts looking at different experience curve rates. The lower end of that is around a 15% rate, the higher end sort of 22%, still not as high as solar, but getting up there. The interesting thing is the 2016 number that we're crunching is going to be below that. It's going to be below even the lower range. So the learning rate that we're seeing on lithium-ion batteries is accelerating due to scale, due to advances in the chemistry, and also due to a bit of coalescing around a few specific battery chemistries. And the interesting thing is when we crunch those numbers into some vehicle economics models, we get a crossover sometime between 2022 and 2026 on a total cost of ownership basis, unsubsidized, where electric vehicles of a comparable class start to become similar to their internal combustion engine counterparts. Now, consumers don't buy on a total cost of ownership basis. Upfront cost still matters. But once you think about more of those new mobility applications, that total cost of ownership part is relevant. And that's also kind of where we start to see, where we're expecting to start to see significant uptake. So when we look at our forecasts out as where this is going in the future, we actually think out to 2020, it's pretty modest, sort of 2 or 3% of global vehicle sales. There's about 80 million passenger vehicles sold in the world every year. It will take quite a while before you get really high penetration of that. But after around 2025 is where we think you start to see significant increases. And what this looks a bit uniform, but what this hides is a lot of regional variation. So some places are obviously going to be much, much higher than this. Norway is a great example. But a large part of the world, and the reason this doesn't go faster, is that a large part of the world will be a bit slower in this. Places like India and Southeast Asia, electric vehicle penetration will still be almost zero in about 2020. So there's still a long ways to go before you get really large uptake, but it is coming quite quickly. And there's an interesting lesson from Norway and all that, which is that once you get to a few percent, once you get to about 4, 5, 6%, then things start to go much faster from there. So we're looking at other markets where that's starting to approach that rate, but it took a few years to get to 6%, and then not that long after that to get from 6 to 29%. So what does that mean for oil displacement? We think this means displacing somewhere around 8 million barrels per day in our conservative scenario from passenger vehicle sales. For context, global oil demand is about 96 million barrels per day. In our aggressive one, it jumps up to about 13. The reason this doesn't happen even faster is that it takes a long time to change over the global vehicle fleet. Vehicles that are sold today will still be on the roads in the late 2020s. But we have one of the most aggressive views on how much impact this can have of all the major forecasting groups and analysis groups looking at this. And if this isn't the same as saying that oil demand will necessarily decline by exactly this amount, because it's possible that macroeconomic factors like GDP and population growth will offset that decrease from electric vehicles. And that's generally the IEA's view. So this is taken from the IEA's World Energy Outlook 2016. And they basically say that yes, actually, oil demand in passenger vehicle sales will peak, oil demand from passenger vehicles will peak and will start to decline. And that's actually quite a significant statement. That, especially if you're in the refining business, that represents terminal decline for gasoline. But basically, what they say as well is that this will be overwhelmed by freight, by aviation, basically by these GDP and macroeconomic effects. Now, there's kind of two things to question about that. One of them is this experience curve part that I mentioned before. And we tend to think of the applications for lithium-ion batteries in terms of what's viable right now. But as that experience curve continues to come down, you will start to see new applications popping up that are viable. Maritime applications, we already heard from that earlier. I think that's a promising one. Maybe further out, aviation. So don't ignore the experience curve. The things that always start out looking like toys can have a big impact on the market. And the second one is a more philosophical or more conceptual question, and that's, will the link between GDP, population, and energy demand hold? And I want to take you to Australia to try and illustrate this. Now, this looks at the power sector, which is quite different than liquid fuels, but it highlights something interesting that's happening. So the red is GDP, green is electricity demand growth in Australia. And so a few years back, when the Australian energy market operator made their forecast, they said, okay, this is where it's going. The next year, GDP went up, and something funny happened, electricity demand went down. So they said, well, that's probably just a blip. So for 2011, they said, okay, it's going to return to growth because the link is still there. And then that happened, GDP rising. Next year, okay, well, maybe it's slowing down, but it's going to come back soon. Okay, now something's really wrong. Forecast now is that it's flat. So you're starting to see this relative decoupling of GDP growth and macroeconomic factors and energy demand. And this isn't unique to Australia. We're observing this across the power system. And there's open questions as to whether this happens with electricity or with liquid fuels, but I think it's important to note. So keep an eye on this if you're looking for how much impact electric vehicles can have and whether they can overwhelm these other factors around economic growth and population growth. I'm just about out of time, but I'll leave you with one final thought, and that's when you're looking at electric vehicles and their impacts on oil markets, think small, not big. So we tend to think of these vehicles that we're all accustomed to in Western markets. And generally that's where electrification is starting in Western markets. It's starting in the high-end vehicles where they can hide the margins a little bit. But what I would say is that actually you should be focusing on these small vehicles. Think small, not big. This is a slow-speed, two-door, two-seater electric vehicle in China. Costs sort of $5,000 to $7,000. They're not highway capable, but they're unsubsidized, they're unregulated, and they're growing extremely quickly. There's going to be about 1 million of these sold this year in China. And the big question, I've spent a lot of time in front of oil companies in the last year talking about where this is all going. And the biggest thing I leave them with, and the thing that I'll leave you with, is if you want to understand where this is going, look to the bottom. If we wait for electrification to happen from the top down, it will take decades to materially impact oil demand. But if it happens at the bottom, then you have it coming out from both sides. And so the biggest question is whether you start to see these vehicles popping up on the streets of Bangkok, on the streets of Delhi, and on the streets of Manila. And if you do, all those forecasts probably go out the window because this will happen much faster than we think. Thank you very much.